Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Mark Ryland. I'm a director in the Amazon security team, and I'm here at this really amazing symposium to share with you some thoughts on improving security outcomes with generative AI. Of course, we all know that CSA is devoted to security, and this conference is devoted to AI, so I felt like this was a good theme to show how these worlds combine. There's different ways they combine, and we'll talk about that. Our focus here today, we'll get into that focus, but briefly, here's our agenda. Why would you use machine learning and generative AI in security use cases? Again, this will be old hat for some of you, but it's, I think, worth covering some of the basics and making sure we're all on the same page and have the same basic view and understanding. We'll talk about some considerations for use cases, like when are the times you should think about using these technologies, and what are the goals and outcomes that you should consider as you make some of these decisions. I'll talk briefly about how Amazon Web Services is using our generative AI in our cloud services and our security-oriented cloud services, as well as many others. And the purpose there, obviously, I want to communicate what we're doing at AWS, but the broader purpose is that by examining some of the uses that we're making, we believe that will give you some good ideas about how you can make use of these services. Another caveat that I'll mention is I'll use a bunch of examples of Amazon Web Services because that's the world that I live in, the world that I know. But I think you'll be able to easily sort of generalize and understand that some of the things that maybe I say that are specific to AWS, you can zoom back and understand a broader perspective and apply this to either other cloud platforms or to your own systems that you build and design and operate. So that's kind of how to think about it in terms of how I talk about AWS. Then we'll go into, in some ways, kind of the heart of the presentation, which is, what are the situations where you want to customize your systems, improve your systems, modernize them using AI technology. And we'll go through some of the considerations in that space. And hopefully you'll get some good ideas and good takeaways from that. And finally, as with any use of AI, we'll talk a bit about responsible AI in the context of security use cases and some considerations and sort of tenets that you should have in mind as you develop and bring these systems into production. So back to that topic I mentioned already, which is what do we mean by security and AI? There's different lenses that you can take on that topic. There's at least three general categories that you can bring into this lower level categories you can bring into this top level category. And I'll just briefly describe those and talk about our focus today. So one thing is you can talk about the security of your systems that you build that depend on or utilize or have as a significant component an AI element. That's a super important topic, and we've developed a lot of content. A lot of other vendors and experts in the industry have got lots of good content out there. And so there's lots you can learn about that. Another area that we can in this general topic is the security from the perspective of what are the new threats and risks that result from the fact that not only good people, the defenders who are attending conferences like this one, but also the bad actors have access to these powerful technologies, and as a result, that could give rise to some new attack vectors, some new techniques and approaches that we as defenders have to understand and defend against, and that's a super important topic as well. But our focus today is not either of those two topics, but it's this particular one, which is as defenders, as security teams, protecting the assets of our organizations, whether those be enterprises or government agencies or not-for-profit organizations or institutions of learning. How do we strengthen our capabilities using these technologies? So that's what we'll talk about for the next a little bit less than half an hour. I mean, we can begin with this kind of high-level question: why is security a good fit for the use of Gen AI, or more generally, machine learning and data science? You can think of Gen AI as kind of the most recent generation, the most recent set of innovations in the broader category of machine learning. The advent of the transformer architecture and other kinds of innovations over the last few years have enabled a whole bunch of broader use cases where much larger and broader data sets are brought into neural networks and then used to provide all kinds of new capabilities that were not possible with the previous generation of machine learning technology. But both of those are still very applicable. And security is a good place to use those technologies because we have lots of data, number one, and data is what drives the power of machine learning technology. We have a lot of need for help from machine learning techniques because we have both experts and increasingly non-experts who need help in distilling data, understanding trends, determining findings, chasing down findings, and deciding and evaluating those, and gradually making it so that we get fewer false positives and don't have avoid the false negatives. Security operations folks, as well as proactive security teams, AppSec teams, for example, often have a combination of skills where they have deep security expertise, but they often need to write code as well, or at least really understand code very well. In fact, that's kind of the big modern trend. As you know, secure DevOps means that we're more and more integrating the disciplines of security and software engineering. And that means that the tools that are provided by AI technology, both in terms of code generation, code analysis, super, super useful. Explainability is also really important, and bringing personalization, bringing together different disparate data sources and reaching new insights from combinations of data sources that might previously have not been combined. All these things make it for a really rich environment for this use of this type of technology. Now, does that mean that the older machine learning technology has gone away? Absolutely not. There's still a lot of powerful use cases, and we, for example, and many other companies and organizations continue to develop our traditional deep neural networks. Deep neural networks really can work very well and continue to sort of shine or be sort of the predominant approach that we often use when it comes to things like anomaly detections and security logs. Here you have normalized data. You can build models that understand those data patterns very effectively and refine and improve those, both with self-learning techniques and also data labeling techniques. That's not gone away. We continue to do that. You should continue to do that for some of your use cases. But what's new and exciting for many security teams is the use of Gen AI, which really helps in a different and broader set of use cases. For example, summarization, integrating different data sources, translation, and I mean that word very, very broadly. Anytime you have to translate, whether it's human language to human language, human intention to machine language, like software, like programming languages, or vice versa, this technology is extremely good at that and super powerful. So things that used to require for a security operations expert some knowledge of SQL or various kinds of query languages, now you can literally write, well-crafted human sentences that express your intent carefully and get really, really good results without having to actually write code per se. So in general, kind of the machine to human interface, kind of inputs and outputs from the ways humans interact with machines, this is where Gen AI really, really sings and provides some great capabilities. It's important to have, as you move into this area, though, as in many parts of life, specific goals. Don't boil the ocean. Don't aim too broad and too wide. Think about what it is you're trying to achieve with a project or a use case or a proof of concept. Are you trying to use Gen AI to create a more automated kind of explanation or reporting or summarization of data that you have in your environment? Are you looking for, again, detection or highlighting of anomalies or unusual behaviors, prioritization, groupings, summarization? These are all super useful capabilities that we and others have found as we integrate into our security teams, and the tools that we provide to them have had some great benefits. And ultimately, this is all about helping people to be more effective. We want to increase effectiveness and reduce frustration, bottom line, and save time, of course. And that involves things like knowledge transfer and training, enabling the newer employee, the less sophisticated employee, to both learn from the experts, because the experts are helping to design and label the data and provide the tools that are necessary to make these enhancements. And get up to speed more quickly and just in general improve the human experience. So these are all things that we're aiming for and we can all achieve together using some of these new technologies. So as I said at the beginning, I'll take a bit of a dive into some capabilities that we've added to our security services. And again, I think the point here is, first, of course, I'm happy for you to learn about these things and features in our cloud. but they also provide a kind of window into ways that you can utilize this type of technology, either in other platforms or in the systems and applications that you build. Here are some examples. We have improvements across a number of our security services, Amazon Detective, Inspector with code remediation capabilities. So not only detecting anomalies or bugs in code, security related ones, but actually suggesting specific fixes for you. And I'll give you a brief demo of some examples of that. Amazon Q, which is our sort of general purpose name for the sort of business use of Gen AI across a number of our services and capabilities. We've integrated that into various IDEs to help the developers in writing code and writing tests and writing documentation, all kinds of things to enhance and make more efficient the developer experience. And then analytics capabilities, where we enhance things like Security Lake, which is our security data lake service, and as well as just QuickSight, more generally, QuickSight being our analytics tool that you can apply to any type of data that you have. All these things can be and have been enhanced with generative AI, and I'll give you some more specific examples of that. We'll start with Detective. So with Detective, this is a tool that's used by defenders, by threat hunting teams, that does a lot of the work for you initially, which is specifically the correlation of events, building that graph database of all the ways in which various kinds of log data is correlated, different data sources, including things like CloudTrail logs in our environment, which is the API logging that goes on across all of our different services. Guard duty findings, which is a security-specific threat detection service. Security Hub, VPC flow logs, which is basically the metadata about all the network flows going on in your environment. All those things get ingested and correlated so that items that would not otherwise be related or easily relatable, at least in the human mind, can now be connected, and you can then begin to see the value of kind of pivoting from one data point to another, and how things are connected in ways in which in their kind of raw logging they're not connected. So a great example is in the finding groups. This is a new capability that we've added recently, which takes some existing finding capability we have, but now it more broadly integrates those, as well as providing a much better human interface of explanation, or things to consider as you examine the findings that you're looking at. I mean, this example that's on the screen is of it's correlating some things. There's an instance whose credentials have been detected to being used to call APIs from some other location, not the instance from which they emerge, because as those who are AWS experts will know, when every API call is logged in CloudTrail, there's a certain identity field in that log record, which indicates essentially where did this EC2 role credential, where did it come from, where did it emerge from, and what instance is it associated with. And when GuardDuty detects that that's not the location of the instance itself, doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong, because it's not illegitimate to use those role credentials elsewhere, but it's not usual, and it's an indication that something might be wrong. And so GuardDuty creates a finding that in and of itself, again, may not be a matter of urgency, but if you correlate that with other things, for example, an open port, in this case a Grafana instance running that open source code, open to the internet. Again, there are valid use cases for that. So that in and of itself isn't necessarily cause for alarm. And finally, a CVE in the software that's running on that service, on that system. That's a pretty important and significant correlation of three, potentially unrelated details, which Detective will bring together for you and help you to understand whether it's something that you do need to urgently deal with. Moving on to Lambda, Inspector for Lambda. So Inspector for Lambda does some nice things in terms of scanning your code, whether that code is in a zip file or a container, however it's packaged. And it gives you actual remediation instructions. I'll give you a quick screen recording demo here. Instead of, sometimes we'll get these rather, long lists of potential issues, like you see on the screen. And that can be daunting. And if it's just, hey, I've got 100 findings, you're like, oh, great, now what do I do? But in this case, what this inspector integration is able to do with the help of Gen AI is to not only show you the code where it detects a potential problem, in this case, unfiltered logging of user input, essentially, which can lead to various kinds of problems if that data is not cleansed in some way. It actually suggests the code change directly in the console. Says like, or substitute this code for that code, and this problem will go away. And similarly with like using old API versions, the old version supported, but there's reasons to use the new version, and it will flag those kinds of things for you and make, again, suggest the actual cut and paste improvement that you can put into your code. A similar capability can be built right into your IDE with something like Amazon Q for Developer. It does security code scanning. This uses both traditional static code analysis capabilities, some of the formal verification techniques that we have developed and pioneered and deployed that have been there for a while in our developer tools. And then add to that the code generation capabilities of Gen AI, as well as the ability to generate tests and documentation, and you get some really, really powerful new services that really increase the efficiency and effectiveness of developers. A great thing about that comes up in this context is, sometimes people will say, well, what about this? This code is built on vetted and reasonable code bases. The models are trained on that. But what about the issue of software licensing? So, for example, you might have software that when the system looks in its corpus, it can detect that, hey, this code is very similar to a Apache licensed software module that was part of the training data, or it could be GPL licensed. And those different licenses of open source software can be very relevant to the decision in a given environment as to whether it's you should use that code. You may not be authorized to use, for example, more restrictive open source licenses in your, say, enterprise code because of requirements that may impose on you that your company isn't willing to accept, while you can use more permissive licenses. And so the license of the code is very relevant, and that's actually surfaced to you by this tool. So it actually indicates for you what kind of, if it's open source software that is close enough to be considered a copyright similarity, copyrightable similarity, it will tell you, hey, this is the license, and you can make a decision about whether that's acceptable or not. Again, quick screencast demo. You can just literally write out human language requests and see that code generated. Again, you're seeing this common in the industry. But we continue to, constantly train and improve these models, and I think you'll find that our Q Developer is one of the best services out there in this regard. And the individual use is free, and then there's a business license as well if you want to get access to some of the more sophisticated capabilities. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about Amazon Q. Q and QuickSight. So QuickSight is our analytics capability. This can be applied to business data, can be applied to security data, any data that you have essentially that's in some kind of normalized format, like Security Lake or in a database. You can use this tool for visualization, for charting and graphing, for projections and so forth. But what you can also do now is just ask essentially free text human questions of the data and get some, very, very powerful answers that are previously would have required someone with skills in SQL or some other kind of computer language, where now the human language that you utilize to ask those kind of questions is sufficient to generate very, very powerful new insights. So that's an example of the use of generative AI in some of our services. Now let's go on to how you might use this in your environments. And so we'll talk for the next segment about building custom features or new capabilities in your systems using generative AI, and specifically in some of your security tools. So when would you do this? So here's some kind of prerequisites. You're going to have some use cases or data sources that say a cloud service doesn't have access to, or that's much more narrow and tailored to your specific business. You're going to have particular requirements and organizational necessities and prerequisites that are unique to your world, and therefore are going to require some custom work on your behalf. And also, just as part of, again, the general trend I mentioned before, is that security teams more and more are also software engineering teams. We're really taking those two disciplines that used to be quite distinct, very bright, talented security engineers who knew everything about security, but when it came time to, for example, work on some kind of remediation or to automate some remediation, they would have to hand that off to someone else because they were not, they didn't have the software development skills. And now we find that while maybe humans are still somewhat leaning one direction or the other, the teams tend to more and more have components, individuals in those teams who work together to share those two skill sets and to move more and more towards software engineering and automation as a solution to many of the challenges that we've historically faced in the security world. The challenges of literally just not having enough time and energy to deal with all of the kinds of issues that come up. So now in a modern security organization, security engineers, that skill set is still incredibly important. But what we also know is that once they identify an issue or a class of issues or pattern, instead of having a kind of repetitively dealing with those issues over and over again, we hand those off to an engineering team, or if the humans are capable, then that same person can then write some code to then manage that class of issues and greatly simplify the workflow, all the way from more automated alerting and detection, all the way to that, and then more automated delegation of decisions about that. So like the first phase typically is I write some code to detect this thing that used to be a manual detection. Okay, great. Now what do we do? You might not be ready for full closed loop automation. For example, you see something you don't like, but you are hesitant to shut it off automatically because you're not sure that it wasn't acceptable, or according to some human's intent, someone in the system, hey, said this is an acceptable behavior, acceptable risk. So an intermediate step that teams often use is to then automatically create a ticket and send it to the team that's responsible for the issue that you're detecting. Then you measure how those tickets are managed. And if it turns out that 80 or 90% of the time, the response to the ticket is always the same, then you say, aha, I think I can do a full closed loop automation with an after action instead. And you can therefore, for example, automatically remediate some finding with another ticket that says, hey, by the way, we saw this deviation from our standards. We fixed it, but maybe you meant to do that, or that you have some use case for that. So please contact the security team. Let's have a conversation, and we'll improve our automation to allow for certain kinds of deviations from our standards, what have you. So you move from purely manual process to automated, semi-automated processes to fully automated processes. And you can do that continuously and continuously improve your capabilities and efficiency. So that's kind of the background for how the software engineering and security are coming together. And now we combine that with Gen AI tooling, and there's even more we can do. And in particular, we can use these tools to take the intelligence that's sort of buried in our different data sources, aggregate those together, and then make even better security outcomes using things like Security Lake, using the fact that Security Lake has this normalized data format. So while Gen AI can help us deal with non-normalized data, normalized data has some real big benefits still, and it's still worth an effort where we can to normalize data. And the open cybersecurity schema framework, which is the basis for the schema of Security Lake, is a very broadly adopted open framework that more than 100 companies and enterprises and ISVs have signed up to both either emit or consume security events in this particular format, which makes a really powerful new kinds of integrations which are possible. So if you take nothing away from this talk, go look into OCSF and see how it can benefit your organization, because independent of the use in AWS, I think you'll find it's extremely powerful. And we have customers who absolutely in love with OCSF for both their cloud events and their on-premises work as well. And then you can leverage services like the Gen AI service we mentioned, Q for Business, Amazon Bedrock, to then get even greater benefit using Gen AI. Now, there's different ways that you can approach a Gen AI usage. And they vary in kind of the intensity and the amount of effort involved, and kind of the amount of customization that you're doing of this environment. They range all the way from just, better prompt engineering. So you might take a user input, and based on your software processes and your Q&A processes, you realize that if we take this user input and we add some of this data in terms of how the prompts are done, then we'll always get better results. That's kind of the minimum customization, and it's pretty much universal that there's at least some level of prompt engineering when using LLMs and other types of foundation models. The next level of customization, and this is probably the most common one that is typically adds the most value with the least amount of effort, is something called retrieval augmented generation. You're probably familiar with this if you're coming to an AI conference, but I'll just briefly summarize and say that in this case, what we're doing is we're using software to then take the human input or the software input, whatever the input is, grab additional data that we know to be relevant to that initial input from some system that we operate as an organization, some database or some tools or some document, a repository, something like that. We add that context to the prompt in the background so the user or the software is not aware of that. And that is then submitted to the LLM, and then we get back much more powerful, rich, and fine-tuned results that are specifically useful for our use cases. Another really important benefit of this is that at the RAG level, you can apply access control rules. So for example, if user X doesn't have the privilege or the right to see certain data within your enterprise data source, the RAG step will get access denied. And so that data will never get into this whole end-to-end flow. Whereas if they do have the right to access that data, it will become part of that augmented process. And therefore, while you can't trivially or easily add access control to models themselves, at least in the current state of the technology, and therefore data in the models is susceptible to certain risks that we typically don't accept, for example, in a traditional database. By using RAG, you can fine-tune that. You can more carefully control access to critical data, not have that in a system that isn't bound to our existing identity and access management capabilities, but still take advantage of the power of these models. So RAG is really kind of the sweet spot for many users, enterprise or government organizations. Fine-tuning is another option. This is where you take your enterprise-specific data or your usage-specific data and add that as kind of another layer to the inference process that will then apply to the inference process. This can be very powerful and very useful. And then finally, there is the possibility of training your own models. And again, this probably can make sense in some of the more traditional neural network scenarios, deep neural networks. Not as likely that it makes sense for these very large models where the training costs are very high, and the data requirement for very large data sets is really there. So while we do have customers that train their own models, and I'm sure that will continue, I would say that's not the common case. That's pretty unusual for especially building very, very large models. So most of you and most of us in our organizations will fit into one of these, probably the number 2 or number 3 as an option. So speaking of something like a RAG system, just briefly, this would be a kind of sample architecture you would use in AWS using our various services, our serverless capabilities. And this is the way you might build an application today. But what we're adding now is the ability to use Bedrock or SageMaker or other AI type services as the back end, and to use RAG engines to then utilize your enterprise data as part of your system, your application. If you're, to get started with some of these things, I would recommend you take a look at a very general purpose GenAI chatbot that we've developed and released on GitHub. It allows you to experiment and play around with a lot of the technologies I talked about, including different RAG sources, different models. You can actually get the code using this QR code, and I encourage you to download and experiment. So then finally, in the last section of our talk, we wanted to talk a little bit about responsible use of AI technology. We all need to take responsibility for the use of this new technology. There are some new challenges. Gen AI technology and these large models, they have the characteristic of not being 100% deterministic in their behavior. So that requires some new risk analysis and some new controls and some new oversight. So you want to establish, first of all, a policy in your organization, acceptable use policy. Make sure your employees and your engineers understand that and buy into that. You want to do monitoring and governance of those policies. So governance and monitoring then are the way in which you help to ensure that everyone in your organization is following your acceptable use policies. When using these systems, you want to make sure that the outputs of these systems, typically you're not going to use that as authoritative guidance. Instead, it's a helper to human experts, or it's a helper to people who aren't experts, because it's giving them expert opinion and advice. But you still typically are going to want humans in the loop. So you'll, at least in your first generation and early usage, you're going to want to have your human experts in the workflows of the systems that you design and operate. You also need to secure the applications, of course. This is more traditional security, right? Make sure that you have things like least privilege, patch management, DevOps pipelines to do all your software updates, and do your updates frequently and carefully, and have the right detection and response capabilities as well. And of course, this is an endless loop, right? Because when we build these systems, we have to have the resources and the plans in place to continually improve them over time, and not just treat them as frozen in time, because we're going to continually understand that there'll be changes in the landscape, both in the capabilities, and you'll want to continually enhance those. So here are the key takeaways from my talk. Generative AI, it doesn't replace human expertise, but it will greatly improve the performance of the security teams who embrace it. So you should very much dive into this technology, find the good use cases, and begin those experiments. But then you'll certainly find some very valuable capabilities that you'll want to bring into production. You want to evaluate some of the cloud native features, both because they're inherently very useful, and I encourage you to use them and benefit from those. They're also a good food for thought, that you'll understand, okay, if this system is using Gen AI to do this new cool feature, what would that mean for me in the systems that I build or operate? And that's a very useful learning as well. Don't expect to have like deep knowledge. Jump in and build and try, and then refine based on those experiments. There's a lot of good training that's out there for free. There's a lot of good sample code. I gave it one example earlier that's out there available for download. And by jumping in and learning, you'll begin to develop the understanding you need to see what the best way is to apply this technology in your environment. So I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been great to be here with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.